like to follow along, I'm going to be reading from Mark chapter 15 in a moment. I was listening to a lecture turned podcast while out for a run earlier this week with a fairly prominent Christian theologian, professor, interesting gentleman with a lot of interesting thoughts, but he was discussing the topic of origins and creation and things of that nature. And I'd been rolling around in my head of what to talk about this morning, and kind of juxtaposition of reading through Mark 15 with some verses he threw out as it related to the universe, the world, creation, kind of struck me as odd and got the wheels turning. In Psalm 19, David writes in verse 1, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." In Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 9. "But Pilate answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?' For he knew that the chief priest had handed him, that being Jesus, over because of envy. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. Pilate answered and said to them again, 'What do you want me to do with him who you call the King of the Jews?' So they cried out again, 'Crucify him!' Then Pilate said to them, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they cried out all the more, 'Crucify him!' So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus, after he had scourged him, to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole garrison. They clothed him with purple, and they twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and began to salute him, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' Then they struck him on the head with a reed and spat on him. And bowing the knee, they worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Then they compelled a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by, to bear his cross. And they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. Then they gave him wine mingled with myrrh to drink, but he did not take it. And when they crucified him, they divided his garments, casting lots for them to determine what every man should take. Now it was the third hour, and they crucified him. And the inscription of his accusation was written above, 'The King of the Jews.' With him also they crucified two robbers, one on his right and the other on his left. So the scripture was fulfilled, which says, 'And he was numbered with the transgressors.' And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, 'Aha, you who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross.' Likewise, the chief priest also, mocking among themselves with the scribes, 'He saved others, himself he cannot save. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe.' Even those who were crucified with him reviled him. Now when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of those who stood by when they heard that said, "Look, he's calling for Elijah." Then someone ran out and filled a sponge full of sour wine, put it on a reed, and offered it to him to drink, saying, "Let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. Have you ever contemplated the fact that of all the galaxies, all the stars, all the planets of this vast universe, of all the species, of all the material world around us that exist on this earth. Every animal, every creature, everything with life in its breath declares the glory of God. Only one has ever chosen to mock him. Us. Of all of God's creation that declares his handiwork, that declares his glory from eternity to eternity, there's only one group of creation that ever spat on him, beat him, scourged him, blasphemed him. Us. The irony of that is humbling. When you contemplate the power that in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the divine Word, the reasoning by which and from which and through which and for which all around, including us, was created. That we were created with the purpose of being divine image bearers. And at our best, through him, we're able to fulfill that calling. But at our worst, we are no better than the ones that nailed him to a cross. It's astounding when you think about it, that the very created could do that to the Creator. And when you think about what it meant in that culture to be mocked in such a way, we don't live in quite the same society as the first century Jews and Romans. They lived in a society that actually knew a thing called shame that we seem to have forgotten as a people. I'm reminded of a fairly popular thinker these days, psychologist turned prominent public figure, tweeted out a year ago in June for reasons you can infer. I remember when pride was a sin. I do too. Wasn't that long ago. Long ago did we forget what it meant to know shame as a people, as a nation, as a culture. But for them, that was everything. Your name, your reputation was what would live on. And so the absolute humiliation of a cross, it wasn't intended just to punish you in a way that took your life. It was intended to punish you in a way that took your name, that took any chance of people wanting to remember you, wanting to be associated with you, wanting anything other than to mock and deride you. Your name would go down as a joke in the annals of history. You'd be remembered as nothing more than that person that was brutalized by the Roman guards. You think you're a king? We'll show you who's king. You think you're boss? We'll show you who's boss. It was reserved for the worst of the worst, and you see that over and over throughout historical context. In roughly 50 BC, the Roman historian Cicero wrote about crucifixion. Wretched is the loss of one's good name in the public courts. Wretched, too, a monetary fine extracted from one's property. And wretched is exile. But still, in each calamity, there is retained some trace of liberty. Even in death is set before us, we may die in freedom. But the executioner, the veiling of heads, and the very word cross, let them all be far removed from not only the bodies of Roman citizens, but even from their thoughts, their eyes, and their ears. There are the words of a man haunted by the sight of mangled bodies that had been beaten and scourged, nailed to a cross. Guys, let's forget about that concept. Let's forget even the very word, this is too much. This is too far. And yet again, in that moment, we see an irony. That in an attempt to take his good name, in the attempt to abolish his memory, to wipe him from history, it lasted all of about 3 days. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, Paul writes that for I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "Take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes." The greatest symbol that empire could throw of shame, of power, of destruction of what this man taught is the very thing we come here today to remember, because that was not the end of the story. In Isaiah chapter 53, beginning in verse 3, we read that he is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken, and they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the labor of his soul, and he shall be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. This morning we come to remember him, his body that was broken, that we might be made whole, his blood that was shed that we might be cleansed, his name that was attempted to be taken, his legacy that was attempted to be taken, that we come here this morning to carry on, as Christians throughout the millennia have, and as we will continue until the day that he returns. In man's greatest act of defiance, the created attempted to destroy the Creator. But 3 days later, they learned what it meant to possess the power of life. Examine yourself this morning and ask yourself, have you come to know that power? Are you living like it? In the last week, have you mocked him? Have you reviled him? Have you spat on his grave? Or have you remembered him? Examine your heart this morning. Ask yourself, for only you can answer that question for yourself. And I'll leave you with the words that are at the conclusion of the psalm, that are some of the only words spoken by Jesus on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? or the beginning of Psalm 22. But the ending, that's what we're here for this morning. In verse 30 and 31, a posterity shall serve him. It will be recounted of the Lord to the next generation. They will come and declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has done this. We this morning, as we partake of this bread and we partake of this cup, as we examine our hearts and our minds, as we reflect on our own failings, as we reflect on the restoration that we have found through him, in him, by him, as we remember him, we are the posterity. I can't help but think that we are the creation finally fulfilling its purpose of worshiping the Creator as we remember him this morning. Think on those things as you partake of the bread. Think on those things as you partake of the cup. It's not just some cracker or some juice. It is to mean much more than that to each of us. Remember him this morning as we partake.